April 6, 2023, the day Pokémon Go changed forever. On this day, Niantic introduced one of their most controversial decisions, the Remote Raid Nerf. Seeing that this month marks 1 year since the change, I wanted to reflect on how things have been since then. So today I'll be talking about my experience with the Remote Raid Nerf, Niantic's handling of the situation, and go over a few possible solutions to help the raiding community. Let's talk about it. Welcome back, everyone. So before we get into this, I want to make it clear this isn't intended to be a video bashing Niantic or a rant to return remote raid passes to their former state. Really, I'm doing this for 3 reasons. 1, I want to break down the remote raid nerf situation. 2, to talk about my own remote raid experience, both pre and post nerf. And 3, I want to present possible solutions and get feedback from the community on how to improve the raiding system. Besides returning raid passes to where they were, of course, because we all know that's never going to happen. But with all that out of the way, let's begin. So I gotta be honest with y'all, the game really hasn't felt the same since the remote raids were nerfed. While there have been some exciting and unique events, features, and releases over the past year, it really hasn't changed the community's bitterness towards the game or Niantic. I'm sure most of you know the story by now, but for a quick recap, Niantic made major changes to the remote raid pass system on April 6th. These included the passes almost doubling their previous price, along with limiting the amount of remote raids you can do to 5 a day. Granted, we have seen the limit raised during certain events like Raid Days, the Go Tour, and Go Fest, but those events have been few and far between. Besides these rare limited time events, the raiding community has taken a massive dive because of these changes. Now before I give my thoughts on the remote nerfs, I want to talk a little bit about my experience with remote passes. Prior to their introduction, I didn't really do too many raids outside of raid day or weekend events. Between 2018 and 2020, I had a decent amount of gyms around where I was living, and I also worked for Disney World, so there were a bunch of gyms over there as well. However, despite being able to access most of these gyms, finding other players to help defeat raids proved to be a challenge. Out of the hundreds of legendaries I saw over the years, there were only a handful I was able to complete. Then the pandemic hit, and we all know how that went. Stay-at-home orders, social distancing, and pretty much the end of all outdoor activities besides exercising. And this essentially killed raiding for a bit, as most gyms were in areas that groups couldn't congregate at safely. However, once remote passes were added to the game, everything changed. I started growing a community around the area, with many players joining me for raids remotely. And this was pretty great, because not only was I able to raid more, but I also made friends that would help keep me sane and social over the next 6 months. And if I didn't have any friends that were around at the time for a raid, I could just hop on a Discord or Facebook group and rally a few players to help me beat it. Legendary bosses were fairly difficult at the time, but with the remote passes and invites, I was able to complete any local raid that showed up over the first couple months. Now, along with the raids around me, I also participated in a lot of raids that I was invited to. I have many friends from around the country that also play, so this gave me an opportunity to play with my friends from my hometown in Massachusetts, the town where I went to college, and more. So between having more players to raid with locally and globally, the remote raid pass made fantastic improvements for the raiding community. Now fast forward to March 30th, 2023, Niantic announced that they would be making drastic changes for remote raids. And as you would expect, most players were very frustrated, myself included. This is why the Hear Us Niantic campaign returned to social media, as the community hoped that Niantic would reconsider the changes. But alas, no changes or considerations were made, and remote raiding has been in its nerf state for over a year now. And this brings me to my post-nerf remote raiding, which has been far less than before the change. On average, I'd say I'd be doing 10 to 15 remotes per week, to only 3 between April 6th and Go Fest 2023. Overall, I'd say there were 2 main factors for my lack of remoting. For one, the price. I just felt that the passes were way too expensive for what I was getting. I also didn't have any reliable gyms to get Pokecoins in the game, and I really didn't want to spend too much of my own money on passes. But along with the increased price, there also weren't a lot of bosses that I wanted to raid at the time. I mean, we had the Shiny Top Boost debut shortly after the nerf, however they weren't as useful back then. They're honestly a little better now getting Nature's Madness this season, though still nothing I drop a ton of passes on. We also had a ton of repeat legendaries come back to the game, so there wasn't really much of a drive to remote those either. I'm sure I would have done more raids though if the passes were cheaper, but with where they're currently at, I definitely couldn't afford to do raids like I used to. Now, not only did the nerf affect my remote raiding experience, but also my in-person experience as well. Many of the consistent remote raiders I invited weren't showing up anymore despite being online. While I'm sure they didn't want to do every raid I sent to them, I noticed that there were far less players joining me than before the nerf. I have a feeling that other players were feeling the same way, and that the passes were just way too expensive. Now, in addition to nerfing the remote raids, Niantic also improved the in-person raiding experience to try and soften the blow and encourage players to get out and go. These included getting 3 guaranteed XL candy for whatever 5-star raid boss you defeated, additional rewards, the introduction of Campfire, and the new feature of Party Play. And while all these features were enticing at the surface level, it didn't make the remote nerfs any less upsetting. The fact is, most of these upgrades came after the nerf went into effect, and were also pretty buggy at launch. If Campfire and Party Play had been put in place beforehand and worked as intended, the nerf would have been easier to swallow. Instead, I feel like it was almost like Niantic was trying to throw whatever they could at the wall to try and revive raid communities, all of which did not. Now, the thing that upset me the most about this ordeal was how Niantic handled the entire situation. To be honest, I get where they're coming from, as there was no doubt that remote passes came to dominate the game and in some ways impacted local play, but the way they went about it felt completely disrespectful. It all started right after the Hoenn event, when a line of text was accidentally pushed indicating a limit to remote raids would soon be coming. This caused the community to panic, with many taking to social media to ask what was happening. Unfortunately, Niantic ignored every question or concern presented to them, continuing to post social media updates like nothing happened. Then about 4 weeks later, they made the official announcement regarding the changes, which further riled up the community. Now, despite the outcry of concerns, compromises, and complaints, Niantic continued to ignore the community at every turn. And this is what frustrated me the most, because not only did they impose such strong restrictions without proper alternatives in place, but ignoring the community's concerns about rural communities and accessibility felt really wrong. Now, this silence continued for over a month before Niantic finally took a stance on the Hear Us Niantic movement. In an interview with Esports in May 2023, a Niantic employee addressed player concerns. I'll have the full interview posted in the description, but to sum it up, Niantic heard our concerns, yet felt it was a necessary change to preserve both the health of the game and their mission. They also went on to say that they felt the features that were coming in 2023 would, quote, blow people away. However, a year later, they really haven't had as big of an impact as they intended. I mean, I've tried using Campfire to coordinate raids, and over the past 7 months, I've only been able to coordinate one with players through Campfire. The rest of my time raiding, I've just shown up to gyms right before hatch and hoped that enough players would actually show up. Like I said, I understand that remotes came to dominate the game, and they were afraid they would eventually kill it. But at the same time, they fixed a lot of the problems that raids had, such as finding enough players. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I thought of 3 possible solutions that could have prevented a lot of this negative turbulence for the game. For starters, I think earlier communication about the change would have softened the blow a bit. Granted, it wouldn't completely eliminate the frustration, but having the transparency and time to absorb this information may have helped the game for the better. So when should they have said something about this? Well, I think the best time to announce the process of changing remote raiding was at the start of the season of Mythical Wishes. They could have done the Hoenn Raid Day event the beginning of December, then put out a precautionary statement shortly after. And this is what they could have said. Trainers, in addition to all the stuff we have planned this season, will also be taking some time to address the effectiveness of the remote raid pass. Since its introduction in 2020, it's come to dominate the game in ways we didn't expect. So to ensure the longevity of the game, we'll be making changes to remote raids in 2023. We'll make an announcement regarding the changes no sooner than March 30th, 2023. So until then, remote raid passes will continue to function as normal. But additionally, they also could have included some data on remote passes, such as the regular to remote raid pass ratios, the average amount of remote raids players did each day, and how their abundance affected player numbers. I think that level of transparency would sit well with many players and get a decent amount of the community to reasonably understand the changes. Though not only that, it also gives the potential for internal change to remote usage within the Pokémon Go community, rather than needing a steep limit. Not saying that it would have caused a night and day change, but anything's possible. As for my second solution, I would have liked to see more incentives added to in-person raiding. As I said, they added a few upgrades to encourage people to in-person raid, but nothing too substantial was added on April 6th. At that time, we got a bundle of 3 premium passes for $250, as well as 3 guaranteed XL candy for completing in-person raids. When it came to the passes specifically, this was a bundle that came too late in my opinion. For years, players have been wanting a consistent way to get a bundle of passes. However, the only way we were able to get them was through the rotating shop boxes. And with the boxes, there was no telling when a rotation was ending, or if the boxes replacing them would be any better or worse. A simple solution to this would be to craft bundles of passes in the shop, so boxes weren't the only way to get a bulk amount. So in terms of bundles, I think it's reasonable to offer 3 to 4 options. We could have a bundle of 3 passes for $250, 5 passes for $400, 7 passes for $550, and 10 passes for $700. I think if they offered bundles like these, you'd see a lot more players getting them, especially during raid days like the recent Primal Kyogre and Groudon events. And as for the XL Candy feature, I think there's a lot more they could do with them. When it comes to raid days, I think a ticket offering a guaranteed rare XL candy for in-person raids would be a great incentive to get people out raiding. Now, with such a valuable item being easily accessible, is it possible for XL candy to become a problem? Well, I don't personally think so, because when you think about it, the average player does 10 to 20 raids on raid days, while hardcore grinders may do 30 to 40. If we took that latter number into consideration, that's a little more than 1/10 of a Pokemon's max XL level. That means they'd have to buy 10 tickets for raid days just to max a single Pokemon. That doesn't sound too bad in my opinion, but that's just me. Also, another in-person bonus they can offer is extra Premier Balls to catch legendaries. I'm sure many of you have had legendaries flee despite having 15 to 18 balls available, so providing an extra 2 to 3 for in-person raids could make all the difference between catching and losing a legendary. And this would be especially useful for Primal raids, as they often provide less Pokeballs because of how Primal energy is awarded. Lastly, this brings me to my third and possibly most controversial solution, which is for less harsh restrictions to remote raiding. While they did help raiding a lot, they definitely became more prevalent than the standard raid pass, so I think a limit was needed, but not at the level Niantic set them at. Personally, if I was in charge of the Nerf, I'd maybe increase the price to $150 a pass, $400 for 3, and decrease the limit to about 10 remotes per day, or at the very least during raid hours. This leaves room to address the situation if it's an issue later, while also not completely outraging the community. And had they paired this softer change with better in-person raiding features, I guarantee the game would be in a much better spot compared to where it's been the past year. So to wrap things up, I'm really not a fan of how much things have changed since the remote nerf. While I preferred to in-person raid over remoting, it's clear that this change has impacted both forms of raiding in the long term. And again, it's not just because of the nerf itself, but how Niantic went about it. Like I said, they could have announced it with more transparency, pushed alternative options like campfire or party play beforehand, or done a less severe nerf to test its effectiveness. I feel like any of these options would have been better and put the game in a less harsh state than it's been over the past year. But those are just my thoughts on the issue, and now I want to hear how the remote pass changes have affected you. Also, do you agree with my proposed solutions, or do you have your own that Niantic could reasonably add to the game? Whatever you think about them, be sure to leave your comments down below. And if you enjoyed this retrospective, then be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more Pokemon Go content. So until next time, thank you all so much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you all in the next video.